The divorce papers lay neatly on the dining table between two untouched plates of dinner that had gone cold nearly an hour ago. Daniel barely glanced at them. Instead, he loosened his tie, dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, and sighed the same exhausted sigh I'd heard almost every evening for the past 6 years. "You waited up?" he asked, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I didn't answer. He finally noticed the papers. His eyes scanned the first page before settling on my signature. For 3 long seconds, the room stayed perfectly silent. Then he laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just a tired, almost amused laugh. "Emma?" He looked up at me as if I'd left him a passive-aggressive note about forgetting to buy milk. "This is because of Riley, isn't it?" I stared at him. Nothing in my expression changed. He leaned back against the chair and pinched the bridge of his nose again. "I knew you'd be upset, Daniel. But divorce?" He shook his head slowly. "Seriously?" His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even hurt. It carried the quiet confidence of someone absolutely certain he already understood the situation. "You think I chose her over you?" I swallowed. He smiled sadly. "I was saving a patient." "No. You know that's what happened." "No. You've barely spoken to me for 3 days." "No." His eyebrows tightened. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean..." My voice surprised even me. It sounded calm, steady, almost detached. "This isn't because you saved Riley." He frowned. "Then what is it?" I looked around the house we'd bought together 8 years earlier. The white walls we'd painted ourselves. The bookshelf we'd argued over for an entire Saturday because he wanted everything arranged alphabetically, while I insisted books should be grouped by memories. The small crack in the ceiling we'd promised to repair every summer. The family photos, the wedding portrait, the empty nursery we'd spent years pretending we'd decorate someday. Everything looked exactly the same, except us. "I asked for a divorce," I said quietly, "because saving Riley was the first time you actually noticed I was capable of leaving." He blinked. "I don't understand." "I know." He let out another sigh. The same sigh. Always the sigh. The one that said this conversation was an inconvenience standing between him and sleep. "Emma." His voice softened. "I've had 70-hour work weeks. I know. I've been under pressure. I know. I almost lost a patient. I know. And now you hand me divorce papers because I chose to save the person whose injuries were more critical?" I looked directly into his eyes. "No." "Then explain it." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. 8 years worth of words pressed against my throat, 8 birthdays he'd missed, 5 anniversaries interrupted by hospital calls. Hundreds of dinners eaten alone. Thousands of tiny disappointments that never seemed important enough to mention individually, because none of them, by themselves, destroyed a marriage. It's never one earthquake. It's the slow erosion beneath the foundation. I can't explain 8 years in one conversation. He frowned harder. "So this is punishment." I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't bitter either, just tired. "You still think this is about you?" Silence. He folded the papers neatly. "I'll give you a few days." "No. You'll calm down." "No. You don't mean this." "I filed them 3 weeks ago." His face changed, just slightly. "You what?" "I've already moved half my things." He laughed again, a little louder this time. "Emma, I'm staying at Claire's." "You packed while I was at work?" "Yes." "You planned all this?" "Yes. And you didn't tell me?" I almost laughed myself. There hasn't been room to tell you anything for years. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You're overreacting." There it was. Those 2 words. Simple, dismissive, familiar. Overreacting. When I'd cried after my miscarriage. Overreacting. When he forgot my mother's surgery. Overreacting. When he canceled Christmas dinner because another surgeon wanted the holiday off. Overreacting. When he missed the appointment where we were supposed to hear our baby's heartbeat. Overreacting. When I stopped asking him to come home early. Overreacting. Eventually I learned something. People stop fighting long before they stop loving, and they stop explaining long before they stop leaving. "I've been called emotional so many times," I said quietly, "that I started writing everything down." He looked confused. "What?" "I kept journals." "So?" "So every time you told me I was imagining things." I pointed toward the hallway. "They're all upstairs." His expression stayed blank. Every mispromise. Silence. Every apology. Silence. "Every night I cried while you slept." His shoulders stiffened. "Emma, I wrote down every time you made me feel invisible." He stared at me. For the first time that evening, really stared, as if he were seeing someone unfamiliar sitting across from him. You've been keeping score? No. I was keeping proof. Proof? Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. His breathing slowed. The confidence that had filled the room when he walked in was beginning to crack. Only a little, but enough for me to notice. He sank into the dining chair, rubbing both hands over his face. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything. Then what do you want? I want peace. The answer came without hesitation, because I'd rehearsed it in my mind for months. I've spent years waiting for you to choose us. I don't have the strength to wait anymore. His eyes lifted to mine. You know I love you. The words should have meant everything. Instead, they felt strangely empty. Love wasn't the problem. Love had never been the problem. Presence was, respect was, being seen was. You love me, I whispered, but you stopped noticing me. A heavy silence settled between us. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. The sound filled the spaces our voices no longer could. Daniel looked away first. I have surgery at 6 tomorrow. For a second, I thought I'd imagined what he just said. Then I realized he was serious. Even now. Even after divorce papers sat in front of him. His first thought was tomorrow's schedule. Something inside me finally went still. No anger, no tears, just acceptance. I picked up my suitcase from beside the staircase and walked toward the front door. Behind me, I heard his chair scrape across the hardwood floor. Emma? I stopped. If you walk out that door, his voice trembled for the first time. Don't expect me to chase after you. I closed my eyes. When I turned back, I offered him the saddest smile I'd ever given anyone. I stopped expecting that years ago. I opened the front door, the cold night air rushed inside. Without another word, I stepped into the rain, gently closing the door behind me. I didn't know that before the week was over. Daniel would discover the first journal. And with every page he read, he would realize the divorce had never begun with Riley. It had begun the day he stopped seeing his own wife. The rain had soaked through my coat before I reached Claire's apartment, but I barely noticed. The numbness inside me was colder than the weather. Claire opened the door before I even knocked. She took one look at my suitcase and wrapped her arms around me without asking a single question. You finally did it. I nodded. She stepped aside. Come in. The apartment smelled like cinnamon candles and freshly brewed tea, the same comforting scent that had greeted me every winter since college. It felt strangely unfamiliar, not because anything had changed, because I had. Claire handed me a towel. You want to talk? No. You want to cry? I don't think I can. She studied my face for a moment. You already did all your crying before you left him. I looked at her. She understood. Of course she did. Claire had watched my marriage unravel one quiet disappointment at a time. She had been there after every canceled anniversary, every lonely Christmas, every birthday spent pretending not to care. She had stopped asking if Daniel would come, because the answer was almost always no. That night, I fell asleep on her couch without changing clothes. For the first time in years, I slept through the entire night. No waiting for the sound of a garage door. No checking my phone every 15 minutes. No reheating dinner at midnight. No wondering whether another emergency had kept him away. Just silence. Peaceful, uninterrupted silence. Daniel stood in the empty kitchen long after I had left. The house had never seemed so quiet. He looked toward the staircase. Half the framed photos lining the wall were gone. He hadn't even noticed. He walked upstairs. The bedroom door stood half open. Emma's side of the closet was nearly empty. The dresses she loved, gone. The sweaters she'd folded with impossible precision, gone. Her favorite blue scarf, gone. Even the lavender perfume bottle that had sat on the dresser for years had disappeared. Only a faint scent remained. He opened a drawer. Empty. Another. Empty. A strange pressure settled in his chest. Not panic. Not yet. Just discomfort. He picked up his phone. Daniel, where are you? No reply. A minute later. Can we talk tomorrow? Nothing. He frowned. She had never ignored his messages before. Never. Even when she was angry. Especially when she was angry. He tossed the phone onto the bed. She'll cool down. He repeated it aloud, as though saying it would make it true. The next morning, Daniel arrived at St. Andrew Medical Center before sunrise. The emergency department buzzed with its usual chaos. Doctors hurried through hallways. Monitors beeped relentlessly. Nurses exchanged reports. Everything was exactly as it had always been, except Daniel couldn't focus. "You look terrible." Ben Reynolds, another trauma surgeon and Daniel's closest friend, handed him a coffee. "Long night?" Daniel rubbed his eyes. Emma moved out. Ben froze. "What?" "She filed for divorce?" The coffee nearly slipped from Ben's hand. "Wait. Seriously?" Daniel shrugged. "She's upset." Ben stared at him. "Upset enough to file for divorce? It's because of Riley." Ben's expression changed. "You mean the accident last week?" Daniel nodded. "The pileup on Highway 18. Ben frowned. "Emma thinks something's going on?" "No." "Then?" "She thinks I chose Riley over her." Ben stayed silent for several seconds. Finally, he asked, "Did you?" Daniel looked offended. "She was bleeding internally." "I know, I had to make a decision. I know. So what was I supposed to do?" Ben didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned against the counter. "Daniel?" "What?" "Is this really about Riley?" Daniel sighed. "Apparently not." "What do you mean?" "She started talking about birthdays, anniversaries, journals." Ben slowly lowered his coffee. "Journals? She said she's been writing down every time I disappointed her." Ben whistled quietly. "That's not a good sign." Daniel forced a laugh. "She's emotional." Ben looked him directly in the eye. "Or she's been lonely." Daniel didn't respond. A nurse interrupted. "Dr. Carter? Trauma room 2." He welcomed the interruption. It was easier to save strangers than understand his own marriage. Riley Morgan sat upright in her hospital bed, flipping through a magazine. Her injuries had healed faster than expected. When Daniel entered, she smiled warmly. "Morning, doctor. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." "You did." She laughed. He checked her chart. Everything looked normal. "You'll probably go home tomorrow. Thanks to you." Daniel nodded politely. "You saved my life." "I did my job." Riley hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" He continued writing. "Sure. Is your wife okay?" His pen stopped. "What? I heard 2 nurses talking." Daniel looked up. "They said your wife left because of me." Riley's face filled with guilt. "I'm so sorry." "It isn't your fault. I never wanted to cause problems." "You didn't." She looked unconvinced. "I remember seeing you in the hallway after surgery." Daniel frowned. "What hallway?" "The ICU." His memory slowly returned. She had briefly regained consciousness. She'd heard voices. "I remember your wife standing outside." Daniel's chest tightened. Emma had come to the hospital. He hadn't known. "I heard someone tell her she couldn't come into recovery yet." Daniel searched his memory. Nothing. "I kept trying to tell them." Riley swallowed. "That she should go first." He stared at her. "What?" "You'd already saved me." Her voice shook. "Your wife looked terrified." Daniel felt an unfamiliar knot forming in his stomach. Riley looked down. "I thought you'd go comfort her." Silence. Instead, he had gone back into surgery. Another emergency had arrived 20 minutes later. He hadn't seen Emma again that day, or the next, until she handed him divorce papers. That evening, Daniel returned to the empty house. The silence greeted him once again. He opened the refrigerator. Inside sat neatly labeled containers: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Meals Emma had prepared before leaving. Enough food for nearly a week. He stood there staring. Even after deciding to divorce him, she had still made sure he wouldn't skip dinner. His throat tightened. He shut the refrigerator harder than necessary. "This doesn't make any sense." He walked upstairs. The bedroom felt colder. He noticed a small cardboard box pushed beneath the bed. He frowned. "I don't remember this." Pulling it out, he brushed away a layer of dust. Inside were old photographs, ticket stubs, birthday cards, hospital visitor passes, and at the very bottom, a black leather notebook. Across the front, in Emma's neat handwriting, were 6 simple words: "If I ever doubt myself again." Daniel hesitated. His fingers hovered over the cover. He knew he shouldn't open it, but something deep inside him whispered that whatever was written on those pages was the real reason his wife had walked away. Daniel held the journal in both hands for nearly a minute without opening it. The house was so quiet he could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock downstairs. Emma had always loved that clock. She once joked that it reminded her every second spent waiting for him. He never understood what she meant. Now, standing alone in the bedroom they had shared for 8 years, the sound seemed impossibly loud. Tick, tick, tick. He slowly opened the first page. Emma's handwriting was small and careful, each sentence written with the patience of someone trying very hard to be fair. The first entry wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It simply read, I promised myself I wouldn't start blaming Daniel for every lonely night. He's working hard. He's saving lives. I knew what marrying a surgeon meant. So this journal isn't to criticize him. It's to remind myself that my feelings are real, even if no one else sees them. Daniel frowned. He turned the page. March 12th. Daniel missed dinner again. Emergency surgery. I understand. I always understand. I wonder if one day someone will understand me too. Another page. April 7th. Today my students made Mother's Day cards. One little girl asked if I had children. I smiled and said maybe someday. I cried in the supply closet during lunch. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered that day. He'd called to cancel dinner because a trauma case had arrived. Emma had simply said, be careful. She never mentioned crying. He kept reading. June 18th. Daniel finally had one day off. We planned a picnic by the lake. At 9:15 a.m., the hospital called. He apologized while putting on his shoes. I told him to go. I smiled until the front door closed. Then I packed the picnic basket back into the cabinet. His breathing grew slower. He remembered that picnic. Or rather, he remembered the surgery. He couldn't remember planning the picnic at all. That realization unsettled him more than anything he'd read so far. How many memories had he replaced with work? He flipped forward. The entries continued. Not accusations, just moments. Small moments. The kind that never seemed important individually. Yet together, they painted the picture of a woman slowly disappearing inside her own marriage. Claire found me sitting on her balcony the next afternoon with a mug of coffee growing cold between my hands. You've been out here for 2 hours. I know. You thinking about going back? I smiled faintly. No. You miss him. I do. She nodded. And I don't miss who I became. Claire pulled another chair beside me. Who was that? I watched a young couple walking hand in hand across the street. The woman who apologized for needing attention. The woman who celebrated anniversaries alone. The woman who kept saying, it's okay, when it wasn't. Claire didn't interrupt. She knew I wasn't finished. I started measuring love by excuses. What do you mean? If Daniel came home before midnight, I laughed softly. I called it a good day. Claire looked down. If he remembered my birthday without Facebook reminding him. I told myself I was lucky. If he held my hand while answering emails, I convinced myself that counted as quality time. A long silence settled between us. Finally, Claire whispered, that's heartbreaking. No, I shook my head gently. It was gradual. That's worse. She was right. No marriage collapsed overnight. It crumbled one ordinary day after another. Daniel continued reading until midnight. One journal became two became three. Each one covered another year, another collection of forgotten promises. Then he reached an entry dated 3 years earlier. The day Emma lost the baby. His hands began to tremble before he even started reading. Today our baby died. The words were painfully simple. No dramatic language, no attempt to soften the truth, just one sentence. He swallowed hard. The next lines blurred as tears filled his eyes. The doctor said these things happen. He tried to be kind. I kept staring at the tiny ultrasound picture in my purse. Daniel couldn't make the appointment because another surgeon was sick. He called afterward. He asked if I was okay. I said yes. I lied. Daniel covered his mouth. He remembered that phone call. He had been exhausted after a 14-hour operation. He remembered asking, everything okay? He remembered her saying yeah. He remembered believing her. He kept reading. I wanted him to come home. Not because he could fix anything. Just because I didn't want to grieve alone. He got home at 1:40 a.m. He kissed my forehead. He was asleep within 3 minutes. I watched him breathe until sunrise. I've never felt lonelier than I did lying beside the man I love. Daniel shut the journal. His chest hurt, actually hurt. He stood abruptly and walked downstairs. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway. Everywhere he looked, memories appeared. Emma laughing while decorating the Christmas tree. Emma dancing barefoot while cooking. Emma reading on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He had always assumed those moments would last forever. He had never imagined they could simply end. His phone buzzed. Ben, you okay? Daniel answered, no. What happened? I started reading her journals. Silence. Then Ben quietly asked, how bad? Daniel stared at the empty dining table. Worse than I imagined. Worse how? I don't remember half the things she's talking about. Ben sighed. That's probably the point. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter. I thought I was providing for my family. You were. I thought working harder meant loving harder. I know. I thought she understood. Ben's voice became gentler. Did you ever ask if understanding was becoming too expensive for her? Daniel had no answer. The following morning, Daniel arrived at the hospital looking like he hadn't slept, because he hadn't. Every time he closed his eyes, another page from Emma's journals replayed in his mind. He was halfway through morning rounds when an elderly patient smiled at him. Doctor. Yes, Mrs. Alvarez. My husband forgot our anniversary once. Daniel paused. She chuckled. I didn't care about the date. You didn't? No. She reached for the frail hand of the man sleeping beside her. I cared whether he noticed I was lonely. Daniel stood perfectly still. Mrs. Alvarez smiled sadly. People rarely leave because of one mistake. She gently squeezed her husband's fingers. They leave after believing nothing will ever change. For the rest of the day, Daniel couldn't stop hearing those words. People rarely leave because of one mistake. They leave after believing nothing will ever change. That evening, instead of driving straight home, he pulled into the parking lot of Emma's elementary school. Classes had ended hours earlier. The playground was empty. The swings moved gently in the evening breeze. He suddenly realized something that made his stomach sink. In 8 years of marriage, he had never once visited her workplace. Not once. He had expected her to understand every emergency, every late night, every missed promise. Yet he had never taken a single hour to understand the world she lived in every day. As he stood outside the school gates, overwhelmed by that realization, a familiar voice behind him quietly said, You're Dr. Carter, aren't you? You're Dr. Carter, aren't you? Daniel turned. A woman in her late 50s stood beside the school gate, carrying a stack of construction paper and a canvas tote bag decorated with hand-painted flowers. She smiled politely. I thought that was you. I'm sorry. I'm Linda Foster. She shifted the papers to one arm before extending her hand. I teach 4th grade. Daniel shook it. You work with Emma? Linda's smile softened. I've worked with her for almost 7 years. Daniel nodded awkwardly. He looked toward the empty playground. Driving by. Linda followed his gaze. She used to sit over there. She pointed toward an old wooden bench beneath a maple tree. Every Friday, Daniel frowned. Why Friday? Because Friday was usually date night. His stomach tightened. Linda continued. She'd leave school smiling. She always said, Daniel promised he'll be home tonight. Daniel didn't speak. Sometimes she'd even show us the restaurant she'd booked. Linda laughed quietly. She loved making reservations. Then her smile faded. Most Fridays? She looked down. She canceled them before 6. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. Linda wasn't accusing him. That somehow made it worse. She was simply telling him the truth. I remember one Friday, Linda continued. Emma came back into the teacher's lounge carrying a chocolate cake. Daniel stared at her. She put it in the staff refrigerator. Why? Because it was your birthday. His heart skipped. Linda smiled sadly. She said you got called into surgery. He remembered. 35th birthday. He had operated on a teenager after a highway collision. He'd completely forgotten there had been plans afterward. Linda looked at him carefully. You know what impressed me most about Emma? Daniel shook his head. She never complained about you. Never? Not once. Even when she was hurting? Linda nodded. She always defended you. He's saving lives. He's exhausted. He didn't mean to forget. Those exact words. Daniel had heard Emma say them dozens of times. He'd never realized she was saying them to other people, too. Protecting him, even when he wasn't there. Linda sighed. Toward the end, about 6 months ago, she stopped making excuses. Daniel looked up. What changed? I don't think she stopped loving you. Linda hesitated. I think. She searched for the right words. She stopped believing you noticed she existed. The sentence hit him harder than he expected. He thanked Linda quietly and walked back toward his car. But he couldn't bring himself to get inside. Instead, he stood staring at the empty playground. Children's laughter echoed faintly in his imagination. He wondered how many stories Emma had wanted to tell him after work, how many little victories, how many funny moments, how many difficult days, and how many times she'd decided not to bother because he looked too tired. Meanwhile, I was unpacking the last box at Claire's apartment. There wasn't much. A few clothes, books, photo albums, my journals, the ultrasound picture I'd never been able to throw away. Claire walked into the room carrying 2 mugs of tea. I found something. She handed me an old envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Mine. I frowned. I don't remember this. It was tucked inside one of your books. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter, addressed to Daniel, but never given to him. The date at the top read 3 years earlier, the week after our miscarriage. I slowly unfolded it. My own words stared back at me. Dear Daniel, I'm writing this because every time I try to say these words out loud, you get called back to the hospital before I finish. I'm scared, not because we lost the baby. I'm scared because I think we're losing each other too. My hands trembled. I had completely forgotten writing it. Claire remained silent while I continued reading. I don't need you to fix my sadness. I just need you to sit beside me while I feel it. Please don't tell me to be strong. Please don't tell me time heals everything. Please just come home tonight. The letter ended there. Unsent. I closed my eyes. I never gave it to him. Claire gently asked, why? I smiled sadly, because he came home at almost 2 in the morning. And he looked exhausted. So? I told myself. My voice cracked. He'd already had a hard enough day. Claire stared at me in disbelief. Emma, I always chose his feelings first. Tears finally rolled down my cheeks. For 8 years, I always chose his. That same evening, Daniel returned home and opened another journal. This one was different. Instead of daily entries, each page contained a list. At the top of the first page was a title. Things I didn't say out loud. Daniel frowned. The first item read, when you answer work emails while I'm talking, it makes me feel invisible. The next, when you promise next weekend over and over, eventually I stop believing weekends exist. Another, I don't need expensive gifts. I need uninterrupted conversations. Another, I miss laughing with you. Another, I miss the version of us that danced in the kitchen. Daniel stopped. He remembered dancing. Tiny apartment, cheap speakers, burnt spaghetti, Emma laughing because he'd stepped on her foot. When had they stopped? He honestly couldn't remember. Then he reached a page with only one sentence written across the center. I wonder how long someone can disappear before the person they love notices. He couldn't breathe for several seconds. His phone vibrated. A message from an unfamiliar number. Unknown number. Dr. Carter? This is Sophia Bennett, Emma's attorney. She asked me to contact you regarding the divorce paperwork. She would like to discuss dividing the house next Tuesday. Attorney. The word made everything real. Not a fight. Not a threat. Not a dramatic gesture. Emma had hired a lawyer. She had made plans. She had already begun building a life without him. For the first time since she'd walked out, fear replaced denial. Real fear. He immediately grabbed his keys. He didn't know exactly where Emma was staying, but he knew Claire's address. He had only been there once, years ago. Without thinking any further, he drove across the city. Rain began falling again as he parked outside Claire's apartment building. He looked up at the third-floor balcony. A light was on. Taking a deep breath, he walked to the entrance and pressed the intercom. A few seconds later, Claire's voice came through the speaker. Hello, it's Daniel. Silence. Then one cold question. What do you want? I need to see Emma. Another pause. When Claire spoke again, her voice was calm. No. The line went dead. Daniel stood in the rain, staring at the silent intercom. He had spent years believing there would always be another chance to explain. Another weekend, another anniversary, another conversation. Standing there alone, he began to wonder if he had already used up every chance she had ever given him. Daniel didn't leave. For nearly 20 minutes, he stood in the rain outside Claire's apartment building, hoping the front door would open. It never did. Cars came and went. People hurried inside carrying groceries, umbrellas, backpacks. No one paid any attention to the man standing motionless beneath the streetlight. His phone buzzed. Ben, you still at work? No. Then where are you? Daniel looked up at the balcony. Outside Claire's apartment. Ben was silent for a moment. Does Emma know you're there? No. Then go home. I just want to talk. Ben sighed. Daniel, you've wanted to talk for 8 years. The words landed harder than Daniel expected. I didn't realize. I know. But wanting to fix something after it's broken doesn't erase the years you ignored the cracks. Daniel rested his forehead against the steering wheel after getting back into his car. I don't know what to do. For once, Ben answered gently. Stop deciding for her. The next morning, I left Claire's apartment early. Not because I wanted to avoid Daniel, because I wanted my life to keep moving. My students didn't know anything about my marriage. To them, I was simply Mrs. Carter, the teacher who remembered everyone's birthday, the one who stayed after school to help struggling readers, the one who kept colorful stickers in her desk drawer. As I unlocked my classroom, I heard small footsteps racing down the hallway. Mrs. Carter! Olivia, 7 years old, missing one front tooth. She threw her arms around my waist. I drew you something. She handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a crayon drawing, a classroom, a rainbow, and me, standing in the middle with a giant smile. Across the top, she'd written in uneven letters, "You make school feel like home." My eyes stung. Thank you, sweetheart. She looked up at me. Are you sad today? Children noticed everything. I smiled softly, just a little tired. She reached into her tiny backpack and pulled out a chocolate chip cookie wrapped in a napkin. My grandma says cookies help sad people. I laughed through unexpected tears. Your grandma sounds very wise. For the first time in weeks, the heaviness inside me eased. Just a little. At the hospital, Daniel found it impossible to concentrate. He reviewed the same patient's chart 3 times. A nurse finally touched his arm. Dr. Carter? He blinked. I'm sorry. You've read page 2 for 10 minutes. He apologized and continued, but the words blurred together. Everything reminded him of Emma. At noon, he walked into the physician's lounge. Someone had brought cupcakes. A small handwritten sign read, Happy birthday, Dr. Lewis. Everyone gathered around singing. Daniel watched from the doorway. Then he suddenly remembered something. Emma used to bake birthday cakes, not just for him, for his coworkers, his residents, even nurses she'd never met. She would stay up late decorating them after finishing lesson plans. He couldn't remember the last time he thanked her. He wasn't even sure he'd ever noticed. That evening, Daniel drove home and continued reading the journals. Another year, another notebook, another version of Emma he had never truly seen. One entry caught his attention immediately. November 3rd. Daniel finally came home before dinner tonight. We ate pasta together. He laughed at one of my stories. For 37 wonderful minutes, I had my husband back. 37 minutes. Funny how something so ordinary can become the happiest part of an entire month. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered that dinner. Barely. He remembered laughing, then taking a phone call halfway through dessert. He had thought it was a good evening. Emma had measured it down to the minute, because moments with him had become that rare. He kept turning pages. Then he found another list. This one was titled, Things I Pretended Didn't Hurt. Eating dinner alone, sleeping alone, explaining your absence to my parents, going to weddings by myself, listening to people say how lucky I was to be married to a hero. Daniel stopped. Hero. He'd heard that word countless times. Hospital newsletters, community awards, medical conferences, hero. But no one had ever asked Emma what it felt like to share a hero with the rest of the world. 3 days later, Sophia called me. The mediation date has been confirmed. I nodded. Next Tuesday. Are you sure you want to proceed? I looked out Claire's apartment window. Across the street, a young couple was assembling baby furniture in their living room. The man accidentally attached one panel backward. Both of them burst into laughter. No anger, no blame, just laughter. I smiled sadly. Yes. Sophia hesitated. I have to ask because I always ask. Go ahead. If Daniel sincerely changes, I interrupted her gently. Changing isn't the same as undoing. She understood. I'll see you Tuesday. That same afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected visitor. Riley. She had been discharged from the hospital the day before. She knocked lightly on his office door. I hope I'm not interrupting. He stood. No, come in. She carried a small gift bag. I brought cookies. He almost smiled. You didn't have to. I know. She sat across from him. I've been thinking about your wife. Daniel looked down. Soon-to-be ex-wife. Riley was quiet for several seconds. Finally, she said, Can I tell you something honestly? Please. When I woke up after surgery, I thought she was your sister. Daniel frowned. Why? Because she looked at you. Riley searched for the right words. With the kind of love you only see once in a lifetime. His chest tightened. I've never seen someone look at another person that way. She swallowed. But Daniel looked at her. I've also never seen someone look so alone. The room became painfully quiet. I didn't understand it then, Riley continued softly. I think I do now. She stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. Dr. Carter? Yes? My father always said something. She smiled sadly. The people who ask for the least are usually the ones you've neglected the most. Then she walked away. Daniel remained seated for a long time. He realized something that terrified him. Emma had almost never asked him for anything. Not jewelry, not vacations, not expensive gifts, not even flowers. She had only wanted time. And somehow, time had been the one thing he never gave her. That night, unable to sleep, Daniel wandered into the attic searching for old photo albums. Instead, tucked behind a dusty storage box, he discovered a sealed envelope with his name written across the front in Emma's handwriting. Below his name were 6 words that made his hands begin to shake. Open only if I leave. Daniel stared at the envelope for several long moments. His name was written in Emma's elegant handwriting. Just below it, in smaller letters, were the words that refused to let him breathe. Open only if I leave. His fingers trembled as he carefully broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter and a small silver key taped to the back. The key puzzled him. He set it on the table and unfolded the letter. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to leave. If I didn't leave, I knew I'd spend the rest of my life convincing myself that tomorrow would be different. I hope I was wrong. I hope you found this by accident because we laughed together while cleaning the attic. But if I'm right, then you're reading these words alone. Daniel swallowed hard. He continued, Before you blame yourself, understand something. You didn't stop loving me. You simply stopped making room for me in your life. Those aren't the same thing. A tear landed on the page. He wiped it away before reading again. People will probably tell you that you work too much. That isn't true. You worked because lives depended on you. I'm proud of that. What hurt wasn't your work. It was that every time life forced you to choose where your attention went, I became the person who could always wait. Birthdays could wait, anniversaries could wait, vacations could wait, conversations could wait, grief could wait, I could wait, until one day, I realized I'd been waiting so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to come first. Daniel lowered the letter. He covered his face with both hands. Everything she wrote was painfully fair. There wasn't a single cruel sentence, no insults, no accusations, only honesty. He forced himself to continue. Do you remember our first apartment? We had one broken couch, an old coffee maker, 2 mismatched mugs. You used to race home after your residency because you couldn't wait to tell me about your day. You once drove 30 minutes just to eat ice cream with me because I'd had a difficult week. That man loved me loudly. I never noticed the day he disappeared. I only noticed I was eating dinner alone more often. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered. God? He remembered. Back then, he had been busier than ever. But somehow he had still found time. Not because he had more hours, because he had made Emma a priority. When had that changed? He couldn't answer. At the bottom of the letter was one final paragraph. The silver key opens the drawer of my old writing desk. There's something inside I've never had the courage to show you. Maybe it will help you understand why I couldn't stay. Goodbye, Daniel. I truly hope you find happiness. Emma. Daniel hurried downstairs to Emma's old writing desk. It had been sitting untouched in the corner of the living room for years. He inserted the silver key. The drawer clicked open. Inside was only one item, a thick scrapbook. Its cover read, Our Someday Book. Daniel frowned. He slowly opened it. The first pages were filled with magazine cutouts. Dream vacations, cabins beside lakes, tiny cafes in Italy, a little white house with a wraparound porch. Each picture had handwritten notes beside it. Maybe when Daniel finishes residency. Maybe after he's promoted. Maybe next summer. Maybe next year. Page after page. Dream after dream. Always postponed. Always waiting. Then the scrapbook changed. The colorful travel photos disappeared. In their place were blank pages. At the bottom of each blank page, Emma had written a date. 2022 trip canceled. 2023, too busy. 2024, maybe next year. Daniel's vision blurred. The final page contained only a single sentence. I stopped collecting dreams because I got tired of watching them expire. He sat on the floor. The scrapbook slipped from his hands. He finally understood. Emma hadn't left because of one argument. She had left because she had quietly buried hundreds of little hopes until there was nothing left to bury. The weekend arrived. Claire convinced me to visit the local farmer's market. You need fresh air. I need coffee. We'll get both. For the first time in months, I wandered without checking my phone every few minutes. No waiting for a message. No wondering if Daniel would suddenly cancel plans. There were no plans anymore. An elderly vendor selling handmade candles smiled at me. Picking one for your husband? The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, then answered softly, no. He nodded as though he'd heard that answer before. Then pick one for yourself. I looked over the candles. Lavender, vanilla, ocean breeze. Finally, I chose one labeled New Beginnings. The old man wrapped it carefully. As he handed me the bag, he smiled. You'd be surprised how many people forget they're allowed to start over. His words stayed with me all afternoon. Meanwhile, Daniel drove to visit his mother. Elaine Carter had always admired Emma. The moment she opened the front door, she noticed the exhaustion on her son's face. You look awful. Emma left? I know. Daniel blinked. You knew? Elaine nodded. She came to see me last month. His heart skipped. She did? She wanted to say goodbye. Daniel felt dizzy. Goodbye? Elaine invited him inside. They sat in the kitchen where she'd baked apple pies every Sunday since he was a child. Why didn't you tell me? Elaine looked at him sadly. Because she asked me not to. What did she say? Elaine took a slow breath. She asked me one question. What? When do you stop waiting for someone to have time to love you? Daniel stared silently at the table. I didn't know how to answer. Elaine reached across and gently covered his hand. So I asked her something instead. What? If Daniel changed tomorrow, would you stay? Daniel looked up, hopefully. What did she say? Elaine's eyes filled with tears. She said, her voice barely rose above a whisper, I don't need him to change tomorrow. I needed him to notice I was disappearing yesterday. Daniel lowered his head. For the first time in his adult life, he cried without trying to hide it. And miles away, as I sat alone on Claire's balcony watching the sunset, my phone lit up with a notification from an unknown email address. The subject line contained only 4 words. I read everything. My thumb hovered over the notification. Subject, I read everything. I knew it was from Daniel before I even opened it. For nearly a minute, I simply stared at the screen. Claire walked onto the balcony carrying 2 bowls of soup. You going to read it? I don't know. You don't owe him anything. I know. But I looked down at the email again. I owe myself closure. I opened it. Emma, I don't know whether you'll ever read this. I don't know whether you should. I found your journals, then your letter, then the scrapbook. I've spent 3 nights reading every page you've written over the last 8 years. I thought I understood our marriage. I didn't. I thought I knew you. I didn't. I thought you were asking me to choose between you and Riley. Now I understand you were asking me to notice you long before Riley ever existed. Tears blurred the words. I kept reading. I remembered our first apartment, the broken couch, the cheap coffee maker, the nights we danced while waiting for frozen pizza. I keep asking myself where that man went. The worst part is, I think he disappeared so slowly that I never noticed. I stopped, closed my eyes. Claire quietly asked, What did he say? He's apologizing. Does it change anything? I didn't answer, because I honestly didn't know. Daniel sat in his office after sending the email. He hadn't expected an immediate reply. He wasn't even sure he deserved one. Ben stepped inside without knocking. You look like you've aged 10 years. I probably have. Ben noticed the stack of journals on Daniel's desk. You finished them? Daniel nodded. I thought she'd been keeping score. And? She wasn't. He looked out the window. She was trying to remember that her pain was real. Ben pulled up a chair. So what now? I don't know. Yes, you do. Daniel looked at him. You just don't like the answer. Silence. Finally, Daniel admitted, I think I've already lost her. Ben didn't argue, because they both knew it might be true. That weekend, my mother invited me to lunch. She had remained carefully neutral throughout the separation. Not because she didn't care, because she loved both of us. She reached across the restaurant table and squeezed my hand. You've lost weight. I've been stressed. I know. She studied my face. Do you still love him? I laughed softly. What kind of question is that? The only one that matters. I looked out the window. A little boy was trying to fly a kite while his father patiently untangled the string. I never stopped loving Daniel. My mother nodded. I was afraid you'd say that. I stopped believing love was enough. Her eyes filled with sadness. That's different. It is. She was quiet for a long moment. When your father and I were first married, she smiled at the memory. See, he forgot our anniversary. What happened? I threw his favorite frying pan into the backyard. I couldn't help laughing. You did not. I absolutely did. We both laughed. Then her smile faded. But he never forgot again. She looked directly at me, not because he was afraid of another flying pan, because he understood what the anniversary represented. She paused. Being remembered. The words lingered between us. Being remembered, not celebrated, not spoiled, simply remembered. Later that afternoon, I finally replied to Daniel's email. Only one sentence. Thank you for reading them, nothing else. No promise, no anger, no forgiveness, just the truth. Daniel read my reply 5 times. It was only 4 words. Yet to him, it felt like oxygen. At least she hadn't blocked him. At least she'd answered. For the first time in days, a tiny spark of hope appeared. Then Sophia called. Mr. Carter. Yes? I'm confirming Tuesday's mediation. Daniel closed his eyes. I'll be there. Thank you. She hesitated. Mrs. Carter has requested that the process remain respectful. His throat tightened. Of course. After hanging up, he walked to the hospital chapel. He hadn't entered it in years. Not since his residency. The room was empty. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the wooden pews. An elderly hospital chaplain noticed him sitting alone. Hard day? Daniel gave a tired smile. The hardest. The chaplain sat beside him. Would you like to talk? I spent years saving strangers. That's noble. I couldn't save my marriage. The old man nodded thoughtfully. Those are different callings. Daniel stared at the floor. I thought providing was enough. It rarely is. I thought she'd always understand. The chaplain smiled sadly. We often mistake someone's patience for unlimited strength. Daniel felt those words settle deep inside him. Unlimited strength. Emma had seemed endlessly patient. Perhaps she had simply been enduring. The following evening, Claire and I began sorting through the last of my boxes. Most contained books, old lesson plans, photographs. Then I found a small velvet box. I frowned. I forgot about this. Inside was Daniel's wedding band. I looked at Claire. He lost it 2 years ago. You found it? The day after. Claire blinked. Then why didn't you tell him? I smiled sadly. I wanted to surprise him on our anniversary. I opened the lid completely. The ring still shone under the light. Perfectly polished. Waiting. Just like so many other things in our marriage. I quietly placed it back inside the box. There isn't going to be an anniversary anymore. Tuesday morning arrived. The mediation office occupied the top floor of a downtown building overlooking the river. I arrived 10 minutes early. Sophia greeted me with a reassuring smile. Are you ready? No. That's normal. I nodded and took a deep breath. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened. Daniel stepped out. For the first time in 8 years, he wasn't carrying a phone in his hand. No pager clipped to his belt, no Bluetooth earpiece, nothing. He looked directly at me. His eyes were tired, red from too many sleepless nights. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. My heart skipped. He carefully placed something on the table between us. It was the scrapbook, our someday book. I finally opened it, he whispered. I looked down at the worn cover, then back at him. And before either lawyer could say a single word, Daniel asked the one question I'd never expected to hear. Emma, his voice broke, is there any dream in this book that's not too late for us to save? I looked at the scrapbook lying between us. The corners were bent. The cover had faded from years of sitting untouched inside a drawer. Once upon a time, it had represented every future Daniel and I planned together. Now it felt more like an album of abandoned promises. Neither of us reached for it. Sophia quietly closed her folder. Across the table, Daniel's attorney did the same. No one interrupted. For the first time since this process had begun, the paperwork no longer seemed like the most important thing in the room. Daniel waited. So? His voice was barely above a whisper. Is there any dream left? I looked into his eyes I had once trusted more than my own. There are dreams left. Hope flickered across his face. But, I continued gently, they don't belong to the same people anymore. The hope dimmed. I don't understand. I know. I folded my hands together. The woman who made that scrapbook believed love could survive on promises. And now? Now I believe love survives on presents. Silence. Daniel nodded slowly. I deserve that. No. I shook my head. This isn't about what you deserve. It's about what I need. And what do you need? I answered without hesitation, a life where I don't have to beg to be remembered. The room fell silent again. Even the lawyers looked away. Daniel lowered his eyes to the table. For years, difficult conversations had always ended the same way. His phone would ring, a nurse would interrupt, another emergency would pull him away. This time, nothing interrupted. He had nowhere else to be. Only now did he realize how desperately he wished he'd had this kind of uninterrupted hour years ago. He looked back at Emma. I read the letter you never sent. She blinked. The one after. He couldn't finish the sentence. Our baby. She slowly nodded. I found it in one of your books. Emma looked genuinely surprised. I forgot it was there. I didn't know. I know. No, his voice cracked. I really didn't know. I believe you. He frowned. You do? I believe you didn't know. She held his gaze. But not knowing doesn't erase what happened. He closed his eyes. I came home and went straight to sleep. You did. I should have stayed with you. You should have. I've replayed that night 100 times. So have I. There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion, and somehow, that hurt him more. Sophia quietly suggested a short break. Daniel walked into the hallway. He leaned against the large window overlooking the river. A familiar voice spoke behind him. You look different. He turned. Riley. She was carrying a bouquet of flowers. I had physical therapy downstairs. Daniel blinked. What are you doing here? My therapist's office is in this building. She noticed the conference room behind him. Mediation? He nodded. Riley looked at him for a long moment. Can I ask you something? Sure. When I was lying in that emergency room. I remember. You saved my life. I did what any doctor would have done. She smiled faintly. No. You did what a good doctor would do. She hesitated. But being a great doctor doesn't automatically make someone a great husband. Daniel lowered his head. I know that now. Riley handed him the flowers. They're not for me. He frowned. They're for Emma. He looked confused. I bought them because I wanted to apologize. You don't owe her anything. I know. But every time people told the story, she looked down. They made it sound like I stole someone else's place. You didn't. I still want her to know I never wanted to become the reason your marriage ended. Daniel accepted the flowers. For the first time, he realized Riley had been carrying guilt that never belonged to her. When the meeting resumed, Daniel placed the bouquet in front of me. I didn't buy these. I looked at the flowers. Riley did. I stared at him. She wanted you to know she's sorry. I gently touched one white lily. A small card rested between the stems. It read, "Thank you for understanding that doctors sometimes have impossible choices. I hope one day someone chooses you the way you always deserved. Riley." My eyes filled with tears. Not because of the flowers. Because she understood. She had understood before Daniel did. I carefully set the bouquet beside my chair. Please thank her. I will. The lawyers eventually returned to the paperwork. The house, savings, retirement accounts, everything we'd built together. Neither of us argued over a single item. When the discussion reached the house, Sophia asked, Mrs. Carter, would you like to keep the property? I shook my head. No. Daniel immediately spoke. Then we'll sell it. Everyone looked at him. You don't want to keep it? He smiled sadly. It stopped feeling like a home the day Emma left. No one said anything, because everyone knew he was telling the truth. That evening, after the mediation ended, I drove back to Claire's apartment alone. Daniel remained standing outside the building for a long time, watching my car disappear into traffic. He never tried to stop me. For the first time, he respected my decision instead of trying to argue with it. When I arrived home, Claire was waiting with takeout. How did it go? We didn't fight. That's good. It hurts anyway. She nodded. Sometimes the quiet endings hurt the most. I smiled weakly. They do. Before going to bed, I checked my email. There was another message from Daniel. This one was much shorter. Thank you for listening today. I won't ask you to come back. I just wanted you to know that tomorrow I'm taking my first vacation in 9 years. Not to win you back, because I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. Life can't always wait until next year. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop. Outside, the city lights shimmered through the rain. For the first time since our separation, I wondered whether people could truly change, not because they were afraid of losing someone, but because they finally understood what they had lost. The next morning, Daniel boarded a plane carrying only one small suitcase and the old scrapbook. His destination wasn't a vacation resort. It wasn't a medical conference. It wasn't even somewhere he'd always wanted to visit. He was flying to a quiet little coastal town nearly 400 miles away, because hidden inside our someday book was a faded photograph of a tiny blue lighthouse. And on the back of that photograph, in Emma's handwriting, were 7 words he had never noticed before. If we ever get lost, find me here. The lighthouse stood exactly where the photograph had promised it would. Perched on a rocky cliff above the Atlantic, its white walls had weathered decades of storms. Daniel stepped out of the rental car just as the morning fog began lifting from the water. The salty wind hit his face. He looked around slowly. Small fishing boats drifted through the harbor. A cafe overlooked the pier. Children chased seagulls along the shoreline. Everything felt peaceful, the kind of peace Emma had always searched for. He reached into his backpack and pulled out our someday book. Tucked inside was the faded photograph. On the back, beneath Emma's handwriting, was a date. May 14th. He frowned. Then he remembered. Their 3rd wedding anniversary. She had shown him that picture while they were eating takeout on the living room floor. "We should go here someday," she'd said. He had smiled without looking up from the medical journal in his lap. After things slowed down. Things had never slowed down. Now, standing in front of the lighthouse alone, Daniel realized someday had quietly become never. I was cleaning my classroom when the principal knocked gently on the open door. "Emma?" "Yes." "You have a visitor." I looked up. Daniel's mother stood in the hallway. Elaine smiled nervously. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I hugged her. "You never interrupt." She looked around the colorful classroom. "So this is your world?" I laughed softly. "It is." Children's drawings covered every wall. Paper butterflies hung from the ceiling. A reading corner overflowed with stuffed animals. Elaine slowly walked through the room. Then she stopped in front of a bulletin board titled "Dreams for the Future." Every student had pinned a drawing. "I want to be a firefighter. I want to travel the world. I want to build robots." Elaine looked at me. "You always encourage dreams." I tried. She gently took my hand. "I'm not here to convince you to forgive my son." "I know. I'm here to apologize." I frowned. "You don't owe me an apology. I raised him." Her eyes filled with tears. "I taught him responsibility." She looked down. "I forgot to teach him that the people waiting at home also need saving." I squeezed her hand. "Elaine?" "No." She shook her head. "I watched you become part of this family. I watched you protect Daniel. I watched you make excuses for him." Her voice broke. "And I let you." I embraced her again. Neither of us spoke. Sometimes grief didn't need words. Daniel spent the afternoon wandering through the small coastal town. He found the cafe from the photograph. The owner, an elderly woman with silver hair tied in a braid, welcomed him warmly. "Table for one?" He nodded. As he waited for coffee, his eyes wandered across the walls covered with hundreds of photographs left by travelers. Couples, families, anniversaries, engagements, years of memories. The owner noticed him staring. "Most people leave a picture before they go." Daniel smiled faintly. "I didn't bring one." She poured fresh coffee into his mug. "You don't need a picture to leave something behind." "What do you mean?" She tapped the guest book sitting near the register. "Everyone writes a sentence." Daniel opened it. Thousands of entries, some funny, some heartbreaking, some only a few words long. He turned to a blank page. Without thinking, he wrote, "I spent years saving lives while forgetting to live my own." He closed the book. The owner quietly read the sentence after he walked away. "You've lost someone." Daniel stopped. "I already did." She nodded gently. "Then don't waste the loss." He looked back. "I don't understand." "Pain is expensive." She smiled sadly. "Learn enough from it to justify the price." That evening, I found myself opening one of my old journals, not to relive the past, to remind myself why I had left. I turned to a random page. It was dated almost 2 years earlier. "Daniel surprised me today." I blinked. I didn't remember writing that. I continued reading. He came home early. We ordered pizza. We watched an old comedy. He fell asleep halfway through. I didn't even care. For one evening, I wasn't lonely. I smiled through tears. There had been good days, real ones. That was what made leaving so difficult. Our marriage hadn't been miserable all the time, just lonely most of the time. Claire walked into the room. What are you reading? My journal. Helping? A little. She sat beside me. Any regrets? I thought carefully. I regret how long I stayed silent. She nodded. What else? I regret believing love meant asking for less. Daniel checked into a small bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean. The owner handed him an old-fashioned metal key. Room 5. The room was simple. A wooden bed, a rocking chair facing the sea, no television, no distractions. He sat by the window until sunset. As darkness settled over the water, he opened the scrapbook again. Near the back, something slipped from between the pages. A folded receipt. He unfolded it. 2 tickets. Whale-watching tour. Date 8 years earlier, stamped across both tickets in red ink, unused. He searched his memory. Nothing. He flipped to the page where the tickets had been tucked. Emma had written beneath them. Daniel was called into surgery 20 minutes before we left. He apologized. I told him patience mattered more. They did. I just wish once in a while. The sentence ended there. Never finished. He stared at the unfinished thought for a long time. Finally, he whispered the ending himself. I wish I mattered too. The empty room echoed with his voice. The following morning, Daniel boarded the very same whale-watching boat the two of them had never taken together. Families laughed around him. Children pointed excitedly toward the waves. An elderly couple sat holding hands without saying a word. Halfway through the trip, a massive humpback whale breached the surface. Everyone gasped. Daniel felt tears sting his eyes. Emma had wanted to see this, not because it was extraordinary, because she had wanted to experience it with him. He suddenly realized something profound. The greatest loss wasn't all the places they had never visited. It was all the ordinary moments they had never shared because he kept postponing life. As the boat slowly returned to shore, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Ben. Call me when you can. Daniel immediately returned the call. Everything okay? Ben sounded unusually serious. No. Daniel's heart began to race. What happened? Ben took a deep breath. Emma collapsed at school this morning. The world seemed to stop moving. What? She fainted in front of her class. Daniel gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Is she all right? They've taken her to St. Andrews. Daniel was already running toward the dock. Then Ben spoke the words that made his blood run cold. Daniel, there's something about Emma's medical records that I don't think she ever wanted you to know. Daniel didn't remember getting back to his car. He didn't remember driving to the airport. He barely remembered boarding the first available flight home. The only thing he could hear was Ben's voice repeating in his mind. There's something about Emma's medical records that I don't think she ever wanted you to know. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every terrible possibility raced through his head. Cancer, a heart condition, a stroke. Why hadn't she told him? Or had she tried, and he simply hadn't listened? By the time Daniel reached St. Andrew Medical Center, the sun had already set. He ran through the emergency entrance without changing out of the clothes he'd worn on the coast. The nurses at the desk immediately recognized him. Dr. Carter? Where's Emma? One of them hesitated. Room 614. Is she okay? She's awake. He didn't wait for anything else. He sprinted toward the elevators. Just before the doors closed, Ben stepped inside. Neither man spoke until the elevator began moving. Finally, Daniel whispered, What didn't I know? Ben looked exhausted. I shouldn't even be telling you. Ben, I promised to respect her privacy. Daniel's voice cracked. Please. Ben closed his eyes. When Emma miscarried 3 years ago, Daniel nodded slowly. I remember. Ben looked directly at him. No. You remember losing the baby. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Ben took a slow breath. It wasn't just the miscarriage. Silence. Emma almost died. Daniel stared at him. What? She lost a dangerous amount of blood. His ears began ringing. There were complications. Daniel leaned against the elevator wall. I never knew. I know. Why didn't anyone tell me? Ben swallowed. They tried. The elevator stopped. Neither of them moved. They called you 6 times while you were in surgery. Daniel searched his memory. a 16-hour transplant. His phone had been turned off. They left messages. I never listened to them. You were exhausted. Ben continued quietly. By the time you finally called back, the crisis had passed. Daniel felt sick. I asked if she was okay. Ben nodded, and Emma heard you. The words struck him like a physical blow. What did she say? Ben looked away. She told the nurse, "Please don't interrupt his work again." Daniel covered his face. Oh, God. I opened my eyes to the familiar sound of a heart monitor, the white ceiling, the antiseptic smell. Hospitals had always reminded me of Daniel. Ironically, this was the first time I'd ever been admitted as a patient. A nurse smiled gently. You're awake. What happened? You fainted. I remember. She adjusted the IV. Your blood pressure dropped. I nodded. Nothing surprising. The past few weeks had been emotionally exhausting. The nurse hesitated. Someone's here. I knew before she finished the sentence. Daniel? She nodded. I told him you might not want visitors. And? He's been sitting outside your room for 3 hours. I looked toward the closed door. 3 hours. Without leaving, without checking work, without making excuses. A strange ache settled inside my chest. Can he come in? Daniel stood as the nurse opened the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked thinner, older, as though the past 10 days had aged him by 10 years. He slowly walked inside. I'm sorry. His voice was barely audible. I smiled faintly. You've already said that. I know. I needed to say it again. He remained standing, almost afraid to come closer. I found out. My heart skipped. What? About the miscarriage? I froze. Ben told you. He didn't want to. Silence filled the room. I almost lost you. I looked down at my blanket. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I laughed softly, not because it was funny, because I had asked myself that same question countless times. I tried. Daniel looked confused. I don't remember. I know. I looked at him. The night you finally came home, you were asleep before I finished my first sentence. His shoulders slumped. I thought, I know. You thought everything was okay. I nodded. So I stopped trying. Daniel pulled a chair beside the bed. For the first time in years, he simply sat. No phone, no pager, no watch, just silence. After several minutes, he quietly asked, Can I ask you something? Yes. When did you stop believing in us? I thought carefully, then shook my head. I never stopped believing in us. He looked surprised. I stopped believing I could save us alone. The room fell quiet again. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Finally, I reached into the drawer beside the bed. There was something I never showed you. I handed him a small envelope. He opened it carefully. Inside was the ultrasound picture, the only photograph we'd ever had of our baby. On the back, in my handwriting, were the words, Your dad already loves you more than anything. Daniel's hands began to tremble. I wrote that. The day before we lost the baby, he broke down, completely. Years of guilt, regret, love, grief, everything he had buried beneath work poured out in uncontrollable sobs. I had never seen Daniel cry like that. Not when his father died. Not after losing patience. Not at our wedding. Never. When he finally found his voice again, he whispered, I failed both of you. I reached across the bed and gently covered his hand. No. You loved us. He looked up. You just forgot that love has to be felt, not assumed. He closed his eyes. I would give anything to go back. I know, but we can't. The words hung between us, painfully true. After a long silence, Daniel stood. I'll let you rest. He turned toward the door, and Daniel, he stopped. Without looking back, he asked, Yes? I forgive you. He slowly turned around. Tears filled his eyes. But forgiveness, I continued softly, isn't the same thing as starting over. He nodded. I understand. For the first time, he truly did. As he quietly walked out of the room, his phone vibrated. It was a call from the hospital board. A position he'd spent 15 years chasing had finally become available. Chief of surgery. Months earlier, he would have answered before the second ring. Instead, Daniel looked through the small window in Emma's hospital room. Then, without hesitation, he pressed decline. Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds after declining the call. A second later, another notification appeared. Voicemail from the hospital board. He didn't listen to it. Instead, he slipped his phone into his pocket and sat back down in the waiting room outside my hospital room. For the first time in nearly 15 years, there was nowhere else he wanted to be. The following morning, I woke to the smell of fresh coffee, Claire sat beside the window flipping through a magazine. You actually slept. I guess I did. She smiled. The nurse said someone stayed here until almost 3 in the morning. I already knew who it was. He finally left? Barely. She handed me a paper cup. He kept asking whether you needed anything. I smiled faintly. That's new. Claire nodded. It is. She hesitated before asking, Does it change anything? I looked out the window. The rain had stopped. Sunlight reflected off the glass buildings across the street. It changes him. And you? I took a slow sip of coffee. I'm still figuring that out. Daniel drove home after leaving the hospital. The house looked exactly the same, but it no longer felt familiar. He unlocked the front door. Silence greeted him. He walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator. Empty. Emma's carefully labeled meals were long gone. He suddenly remembered how often he'd come home to warm dinners waiting for him. Not once had he asked how long she'd spent cooking. Not once had he noticed she always made his favorite soup after especially difficult surgeries. He opened another cabinet. Tea. Emma's favorite. There was only one bag left. He smiled sadly. You always saved the last one. He boiled water, made tea exactly the way she'd taught him. 1 spoon of honey, a slice of lemon. He took 1 sip. It tasted nothing like hers. For the first time, he understood that recipes could be copied. Love couldn't. 3 days later, I was discharged from the hospital. Daniel wasn't there. At first, I thought he'd forgotten. Then Ben walked into my room carrying a small envelope. He asked me to give you this. I looked at the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note. I wanted to be here today, but I also wanted your first day out of the hospital to belong to you, not to my apologies. I'm learning that loving someone sometimes means giving them space instead of asking for another chance. Take care of yourself. Daniel. There was no request to meet, no plea, no promise, just quiet respect. Claire looked over my shoulder. He really has changed. I folded the note carefully. Yes. She looked at me. How does that make you feel? I thought for a long time. Happy for him. And for you? I don't know yet. Weeks passed. Autumn slowly painted the city in shades of gold and crimson. Life settled into a new rhythm. I returned to teaching full-time. The children filled my days with questions, laughter, and endless stories. One Friday afternoon, Olivia tugged on my sleeve. Mrs. Carter? Yes? My grandma says people can grow. They can. Even grown-ups? I laughed. Especially grown-ups. She smiled proudly. I knew it. Sometimes, wisdom really did come from 7-year-olds. Daniel changed his schedule. Instead of working every available shift, he reduced his hours. His colleagues thought he'd lost his ambition. The truth was, he had finally found perspective. One evening, a young surgical resident stopped him in the hallway. Dr. Carter? Yes? I'm thinking about volunteering for extra shifts every weekend. Daniel smiled faintly. I used to say yes to every extra shift. Really? I thought saying yes made me a better doctor. The resident nodded. Doesn't it? Daniel looked down the hallway where families waited outside patient rooms. It might. He looked back at the young doctor. But make sure you're not saying no to the people waiting for you at home. The resident frowned thoughtfully. Daniel recognized that expression. It was the look of someone learning a lesson before it became regret. He wished someone had told him those words 20 years earlier. A month after leaving the hospital, I received an unexpected invitation. The elementary school was honoring local community members during its annual kindness celebration. The principal approached me after class. We'd like one of the parents to speak. That's wonderful. He specifically requested permission to tell your students a story. I frowned. Who? She smiled gently. Dr. Daniel Carter. My heart skipped. You said yes? I told him I'd ask you first. I thought about it all evening. Finally, I agreed. Not for Daniel. For the children. The school auditorium buzzed with excited voices. Students filled every seat. Parents lined the walls. Daniel stood backstage looking more nervous than I had ever seen him. He wasn't wearing a white coat, just a simple navy sweater. When the principal introduced him, polite applause filled the room. He stepped to the microphone. For a few seconds, he simply looked at the children. Then he smiled. When I was your age, I thought heroes were people who never made mistakes. The room grew quiet. When I became a doctor, people started calling me a hero. He paused. I believed them. His eyes found mine in the front row. The problem is, I confused being admired with being present. The audience listened in complete silence. I spent years helping strangers through the hardest days of their lives. He swallowed. But I forgot someone at home was quietly having hard days too. Parents exchanged glances. Teachers stood motionless. Daniel continued, "If someone loves you enough to keep waiting, don't mistake their patience for proof they'll wait forever." His voice trembled. "One day, they may stop asking. And if that happens, listen before the silence becomes goodbye." The auditorium remained completely still. Even the children seemed to understand that this story mattered. Daniel stepped away from the microphone. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Not because he was a famous surgeon, but because he had been honest. As people slowly began leaving the auditorium, I remained seated. Daniel didn't approach me. He simply smiled from across the room, then quietly walked toward the exit. Just before he reached the door, I called his name. "Daniel." He turned. "I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee." He looked surprised, then smiled with tears in his eyes. This time, neither of us knew what the future would bring. But for the first time in years, the conversation wasn't beginning with an apology. It was beginning with two people who had finally learned how to listen. The little coffee shop across from the school hadn't changed in years. The same wooden tables, the same chalkboard menu, the same elderly barista who still remembered how I liked my latte. Daniel held the door open for me, a small gesture, one he would have overlooked years ago. Now he seemed to notice every opportunity to be thoughtful. We ordered our drinks and sat by the window. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply peaceful. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I almost didn't come today." "I know. I was afraid seeing me would only reopen old wounds." I smiled gently. "Some wounds have to be opened before they can finally heal." He nodded. "I've thought about what you said in the hospital every day." "What part?" "Love has to be felt, not assumed." He looked down at the table. "I don't think I truly understood those words until I started living alone." I listened. When I came home after work, no dinner, no conversation, no one asking how my day was. I realized those things hadn't happened by magic. They happened because you made them happen. He laughed softly. "I used to think the house took care of itself." I couldn't help smiling. It didn't. I know that now. Another quiet moment passed. Finally, he looked at me. "I don't expect another chance." "I know. I just wanted you to know." He took a slow breath. "Thank you." "For what?" "For loving me as long as you did." The sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. I reached into my bag. "I have something for you." I placed the small velvet box on the table. He frowned, then slowly opened it. Inside lay his wedding band. His eyes widened. "You found it." "2 years ago." He stared at me. "You knew where it was?" I did. "Why didn't you tell me?" I smiled sadly. "I wanted to surprise you on our anniversary." His shoulders sank. Another anniversary. Another moment he had never even known existed. He gently picked up the ring. It rested in the palm of his hand like a memory. "I don't deserve to wear this." "No," I answered honestly, "you don't." He nodded. "I agree." Then, instead of slipping it onto his finger, he closed the box and placed it back on the table. "I'll keep it." "Why?" "So every time I look at it, I remember that love isn't something you protect with promises. It's something you protect with time." For the first time in a long while, I smiled without sadness. Winter arrived. The divorce became official on a quiet Tuesday morning. There were no arguments, no dramatic speeches, just signatures, 2 polite goodbyes, and a chapter of our lives quietly coming to an end. Outside the courthouse, snow drifted gently onto the sidewalk. Daniel looked at me. "I hope life is kind to you," I smiled. "I hope you make time to notice when it is." He laughed through tears. "I will." Then he walked away. Neither of us looked back. Not because we were angry, because we had finally accepted that some endings deserved peace instead of another fight. Spring returned. My classroom filled once again with paper flowers, colorful drawings, and excited children counting the days until summer vacation. One afternoon, Olivia ran into the room carrying a small potted sunflower. "It's for you. It's beautiful." My grandma says sunflowers always face the light. She placed the little pot on my desk. So even after storms, they still know where to look. I thanked her with a hug. After school, I set the sunflower on my apartment windowsill. It reminded me that healing wasn't forgetting, it was learning where to face next. Across town, Daniel's life had changed in ways few people understood. He had turned down the promotion to chief of surgery. Instead, he accepted a new role leading the hospital's physician wellness program. Many colleagues thought he had lost his ambition. The truth was, he had finally found a different definition of success. Every month, he gathered young doctors in a conference room. He didn't begin with surgical techniques. He began with one simple question: when was the last time you had dinner with someone you love? The room usually fell silent. Then he would tell them a story, not about medicine, about marriage, about waiting, about all the ordinary moments that quietly disappear when people believe there will always be another tomorrow. He never mentioned my name. He didn't have to. The lesson was enough. One warm Saturday, nearly a year after our divorce, I decided to visit the coastal town from the old scrapbook. The blue lighthouse stood proudly above the sea. The wind carried the scent of salt and wildflowers. As I walked toward the cliff, I noticed a familiar figure sitting on a weathered bench. Daniel. He looked just as surprised to see me. "I didn't know you were coming." "I didn't know you were either." We both laughed. For the first time in years, the laughter came easily. He held up a paper cup. "The cafe still serves terrible coffee." I smiled. Some things never change. We walked to the edge of the cliff together. Far below, waves crashed against the rocks. A humpback whale surfaced in the distance before disappearing beneath the water again. Daniel smiled. "You finally got to see them." "So did you." We stood in comfortable silence. No expectations, no promises, no desperate attempts to rewrite the past, only gratitude. After a while, Daniel reached into his backpack. He handed me our Someday book. "I think this belongs to you." I looked at the worn cover. "What about your memories?" "They'll stay with me." I opened the scrapbook. Tucked inside the final page was a new photograph. The lighthouse, taken that morning. On the back, Daniel had written, "We got lost. We found the lighthouse. Even if we couldn't find our way back to each other, thank you for helping me find my way back to myself." Tears filled my eyes. I closed the scrapbook. "Thank you." He smiled. "No, thank you." The sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold. We watched it together until the last light disappeared beyond the water. Then, without sadness, without regret, we walked in different directions, not as husband and wife, not even as people hoping to begin again, but as two lives forever changed by a love that had taught them its greatest lesson. Sometimes the deepest act of love is not holding on. It is becoming the person you should have been, even after the one you loved has already let go. And if this story has taught anything, let it be this: people rarely fall out of love in a single moment. More often, they slowly disappear inside the silence between unfinished conversations, postponed dreams, and promises of someday. So before that silence grows too loud, put down the phone. Leave work a little earlier. Take the trip. Hold their hand. Listen when they say they're tired. Notice the little things they stop mentioning. Because love is rarely lost in one dramatic goodbye. It is usually lost one ordinary day at a time. And sometimes, the greatest tragedy isn't that someone stopped loving you. It's realizing they spent years loving you quietly while waiting for you to notice.